They ordered her to strip down for what they called a routine security check, snickering as she reached for the zipper of her maintenance coveralls, nudging each other with their elbows while whispering crude comments under their breath. One of them even held up his phone, pretending to scroll through messages while angling the camera her way. But when she turned around, that's when Major Catherine Cross walked through the checkpoint door. Everything went dead silent because the tattoo etched between her shoulder blades wasn't some random ink from a drunken weekend. It was a precision sniper badge from the 75th Ranger Regiment, complete with crosshairs and a kill count that made seasoned officers wake up in cold sweats. And suddenly, the soldiers who had been laughing at her expense weren't making a sound. Want to know what happened when Major Cross saw that mark? Drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. Then hit that subscribe button because we upload fresh content every single day. Now let's go back to the beginning of this story. Sarah Chun stepped through the main gate of Fort Meridian like she'd done this routine 100 times before, which she had. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance that would make anyone look twice. Mid-40s, maybe pushing toward 50, with shoulder-length black hair streaked with premature silver that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her work clothes were standard civilian contractor gear, faded blue coveralls that had seen better decades, steel-toed boots that bore the scuff marks of someone who actually used them for their intended purpose, and a worn leather tool belt that sagged under the weight of instruments most people couldn't identify. She carried herself with the kind of unassuming presence that made her practically invisible in military settings. Not trying to blend in, not trying to stand out, just existing in that middle space where people's eyes tend to slide past without really focusing. Her clipboard was weathered manila cardboard, the kind they'd been using in military logistics since before computers took over everything, and her contractor badge hung from a retractable cord that had lost most of its spring tension years ago. The morning sun was already brutal at 08:00 hours, turning the Nevada desert base into something resembling the surface of Mars. Heat shimmers rose from the asphalt parking areas, making the distant mountains waver like mirages. The air conditioning units on every building were running full blast, fighting a losing battle against nature's determination to cook everything under the sun. Even this early, you could feel the promise of a day that would hit triple digits by noon and stay there until well after sunset. Fort Meridian hummed with the controlled chaos that defined military installations everywhere. Diesel generators provided backup power to critical systems, their steady thrum mixing with the distant sound of helicopter rotors spinning up for morning training flights. Radio chatter crackled from open windows where duty officers coordinated vehicle movements and personnel assignments. The smell of JP-8 fuel mixed with hot concrete and that particular cocktail of coffee, cleaning supplies, and bureaucracy that every service member recognized as home. Sarah signed in at the Visitor Control Center with movements that were economical and practiced. Her handwriting belonged to someone who had filled out forms in uncomfortable positions, under time pressure, while other things demanded attention. Block letters, no flourishes, every character formed with the kind of precision that came from knowing that illegible paperwork could mean delayed supplies, missed deadlines, or worse. The duty sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, glanced at her credentials without really seeing her. Vehicle maintenance inspection on the motor pool, Humvees, he read from her work order. Building 47, Bay 12 through 18. You've done this before? Few times, Sarah replied. Her voice carried no particular accent, no regional markers that would help place where she'd grown up or where she'd served, if she'd served at all. Just the neutral tones of someone who'd learned to communicate clearly without drawing attention to herself. Rodriguez nodded and handed back her paperwork. Sergeant First Class Martinez is the NCOIC over there. He'll get you set up with whatever you need. Fair warning, they've got a new batch of mechanics fresh out of 8, so they might be a little enthusiastic about showing off what they know. Sarah clipped her visitor badge to her coveralls and headed across the compound toward the motor pool. The buildings were standard military construction. Beige concrete blocks with corrugated metal roofs designed for function rather than aesthetics. Each structure looked identical to the next, differentiated only by the numbers painted in black, stencil letters above doorways that had been sandblasted smooth by decades of desert wind. The motor pool occupied nearly an entire city block, with multiple bays for vehicle maintenance, part storage, and administrative offices. The sound of air tools echoed from open garage doors where mechanics worked on everything from standard sedan staff cars to armored personnel carriers. Diesel engines rumbled as drivers performed pre-operation checks, and the sharp smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with motor oil created an atmosphere that was unmistakably military mechanical. Building 47 housed the light vehicle maintenance section, responsible for keeping the base's fleet of Humvees, cargo trucks, and specialized transport vehicles operational in conditions that would destroy civilian cars within months. The work was demanding, technical, and absolutely critical to mission readiness, though it rarely received recognition beyond occasional mentions in efficiency, reports, and budget meetings. Sarah pushed through the main entrance into a bay that could have been lifted from any military base in the world. Concrete floors stained with decades of automotive fluids, overhead fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows, workbenches cluttered with tools both official and improvised, and that universal military decoration of safety posters, duty rosters, and notices about upcoming inspections that nobody read, but everyone had to acknowledge. The noise level was significant but controlled. Impact wrenches cycling on and off, the steady hiss of pneumatic lifts, radio communications from the dispatch office, and the constant background hum of industrial ventilation systems trying to clear the air of fumes that were probably toxic, but unavoidable in this line of work. Somewhere in the back, a radio played, country music at a volume calculated to be audible without violating noise regulations. Sergeant First Class Martinez looked up from a maintenance logbook when she approached his desk. He was career Army, probably 15 years in, with the kind of practical competence that kept motor pools running regardless of budget constraints or personnel shortages. His uniform was clean, but showed the subtle signs of someone who actually worked with his hands, small grease stains that never quite came out, fingernails that carried permanent traces of automotive fluids, and the slight stoop that came from spending years bent over engine compartments. "You must be the contractor," he said, standing to shake hands. "Martinez, we've been expecting you. Quarterly inspection on 12 vehicles, right?" "That's correct. Sarah Chun, Apex Technical Services." Her handshake was firm without being aggressive, professional without being personal. "I'll need access to maintenance records, current service schedules, and about 4 hours per vehicle for thorough inspection." Martinez nodded approvingly. Most contractors wanted to rush through inspections to maximize their daily billings, but she was talking like someone who understood that corners cut today meant breakdowns tomorrow. "We can set you up with workspace in Bay 15. The vehicles are staged and ready. Maintenance files are current, and I've got 4 mechanics assigned to assist if you need anything." "Appreciate it. I'll start with the newest acquisition and work backward through the fleet." Sarah pulled out a worn notebook and began recording vehicle identification numbers, acquisition dates, and maintenance histories. Her documentation was thorough without being obsessive, the work of someone who understood that proper records were the foundation of reliable equipment. The 4 mechanics assigned to assist her were exactly what Rodriguez had warned about. Fresh out of advanced individual training, eager to demonstrate their newly acquired knowledge, and convinced that military mechanical training had prepared them for any challenge they might encounter in the field. They clustered around her workspace with the enthusiasm of puppies, ready to explain things she undoubtedly already knew and offer help she probably didn't need. Private. First Class Jackson was barely 20, from small-town Georgia, with soft hands that hadn't yet developed the calluses that came from daily work with military-grade tools and equipment. His uniform was still crisp from the factory, his boots polished to mirror brightness, and his confidence based more on classroom theory than practical experience. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Specialist Williams had been on base for 6 months, long enough to consider himself experienced, but not long enough to have encountered anything that would teach him humility. He'd passed his certification tests with high scores and received commendations for his attention to detail during training exercises, achievements that had convinced him he understood more than he actually did. Private Kim was the quiet one, mechanically inclined and genuinely interested in learning, but too junior to speak up when his more vocal colleagues made assumptions or jumped to conclusions. He watched Sarah work with the focused attention of someone trying to absorb everything, though he lacked the experience to distinguish between standard procedures and the subtle adaptations that came from years of field experience. Corporal Davis was the senior enlisted among the group, with 2 years of experience and recent promotion that had given him supervisory responsibilities he wasn't entirely ready for. He was competent within the scope of standard procedures, but had never encountered situations that required creative problem-solving or adaptation of established methods. Sarah began her inspection with the systematic thoroughness that characterized professional technical work. She wasn't just checking items off a list. She was examining each system with the kind of attention that suggested she understood how failures developed, how problems cascaded, and how minor issues could become major breakdowns under operational stress. Her approach was methodical but not rigid. She started with visual inspection of obvious components, moved through diagnostic procedures that weren't in the standard manual, and concluded with operational tests that revealed problems other inspectors might miss. The mechanics watched with growing interest as she identified wear patterns they hadn't noticed, found loose connections that hadn't yet caused failures, and diagnosed intermittent problems that had been frustrating the maintenance crew for weeks. "How did you know that alternator bearing was starting to fail?" Williams asked after she demonstrated a diagnostic technique that wasn't covered in their training materials. "Sound frequency changes when bearings start to wear," Sarah replied, continuing her inspection without looking up. "Metal fatigue has a distinctive acoustic signature if you know how to listen for it." Jackson stepped closer, trying to hear what she was describing. "I don't hear anything unusual. Takes practice. Different metals sound different when they're under stress. Aluminum has a higher pitch than steel. Cast iron sounds different from forged components, and age changes everything." She moved to the next inspection point, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through procedures that seemed to flow naturally from one to the next. Kim pulled out his notebook and started writing down her observations, recognizing that he was learning things that weren't in any manual. Davis watched with the expression of someone realizing that his recent promotion might have given him responsibility for knowledge he didn't possess. The morning progressed with Sarah working through her inspection checklist while the mechanics alternated between helping and trying to impress her with their theoretical knowledge. She answered their questions patiently, demonstrated techniques when asked, but maintained the professional distance of someone who was there to do a specific job rather than provide general education. It was during the lunch break that the atmosphere began to shift in ways that would matter later. The break room in Building 47 was standard military issue, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, mismatched furniture that had been requisitioned from various sources over the years, and vending machines that dispensed coffee strong enough to dissolve paint. Sarah sat alone at a corner table, eating a sandwich she'd brought from home while reviewing her inspection notes from the morning's work. She wasn't antisocial, but she wasn't seeking conversation either. Just quietly doing her job, taking her allocated break time, and preparing for the afternoon's work schedule. Her lunch was simple, practical food wrapped in wax paper and carried in a brown bag that had been reused multiple times. No special dietary requirements, no expensive organic ingredients, just fuel for getting through the workday. The four mechanics sat at the opposite end of the room, their conversation growing louder as they discussed their morning observations. What had started as professional curiosity was beginning to shift into something else, the kind of group dynamic that developed when young soldiers found someone they could position as different from themselves. "She knows her stuff, I'll give her that," Davis said, opening his MRE and spreading the contents across the table. "But there's something weird about how she works. Like she's checking for things that aren't on the inspection list." Williams nodded, taking a swig of energy drink. "And did you notice how she holds tools? Not like they taught us in 8, more like someone who learned somewhere else entirely." Jackson leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "My dad's been working on cars since before I was born. He says you can always tell when someone learned a wrench in the field versus in a classroom. She's definitely field trained." "Question is, what field?" Kim asked quietly. He was the most observant of the group, and something about Sarah's movements had been bothering him all morning. "Some of those diagnostic techniques she showed us. I've never seen anything like that in any manual," Davis shrugged. "Probably worked for some civilian garage before she got into contracting. Maybe learned some shortcuts over the years." But Williams had a different theory. "I don't think it's civilian experience. Watch how she approaches each vehicle. She's not just checking for maintenance issues. She's evaluating them like she's thinking about how they'd perform under combat conditions." "Combat conditions?" Jackson laughed. "Dude, she's like 50 years old and probably never been outside the continental United States. What would she know about combat?" The conversation continued in that direction, with speculation building on speculation, assumptions layering on top of assumptions. They weren't being malicious, exactly, but they were doing what humans do when confronted with someone who doesn't fit their expectations. They were creating a narrative that made sense to them, regardless of whether it matched reality. Sarah finished her sandwich and walked to the sink to rinse her water bottle. She could hear their conversation but didn't react to it. She'd spent enough time in military environments to know that speculation was as inevitable as morning formation, and usually about as accurate. Better to let people draw their own conclusions than to provide information that would just become the basis for different speculation. "Ma'am," Kim approached as she was preparing to return to work, "I was wondering if you could show me that bearing diagnostic technique again. I want to make sure I understand the frequency differences you were talking about." Sarah nodded. "Sure. Bring your stethoscope and meet me at vehicle 7. The transmission has an interesting harmonic that'll help you understand what to listen for." Kim gathered his tools and followed her back to the work bay. The other 3 mechanics exchanged glances. There was something about the way she'd agreed to teach him, something professional and competent, that made them feel like they were missing something important. The afternoon work session began with Sarah continuing her systematic inspection of the motor pool fleet. Her pace was steady but not rushed, thorough but not obsessive. She worked with the quiet confidence of someone who had done similar inspections in conditions where equipment failure could have life or death consequences, though nobody watching would have necessarily picked up on that detail. Vehicle 7 was a command variant Humvee with additional communications equipment and armor plating that made it heavier and more complex than standard models. Sarah spent extra time examining the transmission, explaining to Kim how increased weight affected wear patterns and why certain components required different maintenance intervals than the technical manual specified. Official maintenance schedule says this transmission fluid should be good for another 1,000 miles, she said, drawing a small sample into a clear container. But look at the color and consistency. See how it's darker than it should be. That's metal particles from accelerated. Where? Kim examined the fluid sample. Is that because of the extra armor weight? Partly. Also because this vehicle's been operated in desert conditions, where sand gets into everything, and because the cooling system isn't quite adequate for the additional load. Sarah made notes on her inspection form. Textbook says one thing, but actual operational conditions require different maintenance intervals. Davis had been watching this exchange with growing irritation. As the senior mechanic in the group, he felt like his expertise was being questioned by someone who wasn't even military. "Ma'am, with respect, we follow official maintenance procedures here. Those intervals are established by Army engineers who know what they're doing." Sarah looked up from her inspection. "I'm sure they are. I'm just documenting actual condition versus scheduled maintenance so your motor pool can make informed decisions about service intervals." "But you're basically saying we've been doing it wrong," Williams interjected. "That our training was inadequate." "I'm not saying anything about your training. I'm reporting on current vehicle condition." Sarah's tone remained professional, but there was a subtle firmness that suggested she wasn't going to be drawn into an argument about her qualifications. Jackson stepped closer, his earlier curiosity replaced by something more confrontational. "It's just that we've been maintaining these vehicles for months without any problems. And now a civilian contractor shows up and starts finding issues we supposedly missed." "You haven't been missing anything," Sarah said calmly. "These are normal wear patterns for vehicles operating under these conditions. The question is whether the standard maintenance schedule accounts for actual operational stress versus theoretical design parameters." "And you know this how?" Davis asked. "What makes you qualified to second-guess Army maintenance protocols?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Sarah could have mentioned her background, could have referenced experience. That would explain her knowledge, could have established credentials that would answer their challenge. Instead, she continued working. "I'm documenting current condition," she repeated. "Your chain of command will decide how to interpret the information." But her refusal to justify herself only increased their suspicion. In military culture, people were expected to establish their credibility, to explain their qualifications, to provide context for their expertise. Her silence suggested either arrogance or something she didn't want to discuss. Williams pulled out his phone and started recording, holding it casually so it wouldn't be obvious. "Just for training purposes," he said when Kim gave him a questioning look. "Might be useful to review her techniques later." Sarah noticed the phone but didn't comment. She'd been recorded before, in situations where documentation was more serious. Then training videos. One more cell phone camera wasn't going to change how she did her job. The tension in the workspace was becoming more noticeable. What had started as professional curiosity was shifting towards something more personal, more confrontational. The mechanics were beginning to feel like their competence was being questioned by someone who wouldn't explain her own qualifications. And that feeling was making them defensive. Sergeant Martinez returned from his afternoon meeting to find the atmosphere in his work bay noticeably different from when he'd left. The mechanics were clustered together, speaking in lower voices, while the contractor worked alone at her inspection station. He'd seen this dynamic before, and it usually meant trouble was developing. "How's the inspection going?" he asked Sarah directly, on schedule. "I'll have preliminary findings ready by 1600 hours. Final report by close of business tomorrow." Sarah handed him a status sheet that documented her progress through the vehicle list. Martinez reviewed the paperwork. Her documentation was professional, thorough, and exactly what he'd expect from a competent contractor. But he could sense tension in the room that hadn't been there earlier. "Any problems with the inspection process?" he asked. "No problems, your mechanics have been helpful." Sarah's response was diplomatic, but didn't address the obvious shift in atmosphere. Martinez looked over at his mechanics, who were trying to appear busy while obviously listening to the conversation. "Davis, how's our contractor support been working out?" "Fine, Sergeant. No issues." Davis's response was technically accurate but carried undertones that suggested otherwise. "Good, let's keep it that way." Martinez knew better than to dig deeper in front of everyone, but he made a mental note to check in privately with both sides if the tension continued to build. The rest of the afternoon proceeded with superficial cooperation masking growing antagonism. Sarah continued her methodical inspection work, finding issues that ranged from minor maintenance needs to potentially serious problems that could cause breakdowns during operations. Her findings were legitimate, her documentation was professional, and her recommendations were within the scope of her contracted responsibilities. But her competence was making the mechanics feel inadequate, and her refusal to explain her background was making them suspicious. The combination was creating a dynamic that would become more problematic as the day continued. By 1500 hours, Sarah had completed inspections on 8 of the 12 vehicles in her assigned workload. Her findings included 3 transmission issues, 2 cooling system problems, 1 brake system concern, and multiple minor maintenance items that weren't critical but would become more serious if ignored. Standard stuff for vehicles operating in desert conditions with high operational tempo. The mechanics watched her work with growing resentment. Each problem she identified felt like an indictment of their previous inspections. Each recommendation seemed to question their professional competence, and her systematic approach made their own methods look casual by comparison. "She's making us look like amateurs," Williams muttered to Jackson during a break. "Maybe because we are amateurs," Kim replied quietly. "Look how much we've learned just watching her work today." "Or maybe she's just showing off," Davis countered. "Finding problems that aren't really problems so she can justify her consulting fees." Jackson nodded toward Sarah, who was photographing a cracked rubber boot on a steering component. "Why? Does she take so many pictures?" "We document everything in the maintenance logs." "Contractors probably have different reporting requirements," Kim suggested. "More detailed documentation for liability purposes." "Or she's building a case that we don't know what we're doing," Williams said. "Setting up to recommend more extensive repairs than we actually need." Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of someone who would change the trajectory of the entire afternoon. Sergeant First Class Thompson had just returned from leave and was catching up on events in his motor pool section. He was older than the other mechanics, more experienced, and had developed the kind of situational awareness that came from multiple deployments in environments where paying attention to details could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home. He watched Sarah work for several minutes without saying anything, noting techniques that looked familiar, observing methods that reminded him of people he'd served with in specialized units, recognizing approaches that weren't taught in standard military schools. "Interesting inspection methodology," he commented to Martinez. "She knows her stuff," Martinez agreed. "Finding issues we missed, documenting everything thoroughly, professional work." Thompson nodded but didn't elaborate on his observations. He'd learned to be careful about assumptions, but something about Sarah's work patterns was triggering recognition he couldn't quite place. The afternoon was building toward a confrontation that nobody could prevent and nobody really wanted. But sometimes institutional dynamics created their own momentum regardless of individual intentions. The desert heat outside Building 47 had reached that brutal afternoon intensity where the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolence. Concrete sidewalks radiated heat waves that made distant objects dance like mirages, and the metal surfaces of parked vehicles had become untouchable without protective gloves. Even the lizards that normally darted between patches of shade had disappeared into whatever underground refuges they could find. leaving the surface world to the humans who had no choice but to endure it. Inside the motor pool, industrial fans, mounted high on the walls, pushed superheated air in lazy circles that provided the illusion of circulation without actually cooling anything. The building's VACA system, designed for more temperate climates and never adequately upgraded for Nevada conditions, wheezed and rattled as it struggled against physics and losing badly. Sweat evaporated almost instantly in the dry heat, leaving behind salt stains on uniforms and a constant need for hydration that could never quite be satisfied. The acoustic environment of the motor pool created its own rhythm, a mechanical symphony that provided the soundtrack for military maintenance operations. Pneumatic tools cycled on and off with sharp bursts of compressed air, their metallic percussion punctuated by the deeper bass notes of diesel engines running diagnostic cycles. Radio communications crackled from multiple sources, creating overlapping conversations about parts requisitions, vehicle assignments, and scheduling changes that formed a constant background chatter in military jargon and numeric codes. Fluorescent lights mounted in long rows across the ceiling cast harsh, even illumination that eliminated shadows but created its own problems. The quality of light was clinical, unforgiving, turning skin tones pale and making it difficult to judge the true color of automotive fluids during diagnostic procedures. Maintenance personnel had learned to compensate by using portable work lights with incandescent bulbs that provided more accurate color rendition. But the overhead fluorescents remained the primary illumination, bathing everything in their cold, institutional glow. The smell of the motor pool was distinctive and unmistakable, a complex mixture of petroleum products, heated metal, and human activity that every mechanic recognized as home. JP-8 fuel dominated the aromatic landscape, its kerosene-like scent mixing with motor oil, hydraulic fluid, brake fluid, and the dozen other lubricants and chemicals required to keep military vehicles operational. Underneath these primary notes were subtler fragrances, the ozone smell of electrical equipment running at high capacity, the metallic tang of steel filings from grinding operations, and the organic notes of rubber gaskets and polymer components. Slowly degrading under extreme temperatures, Fort Meridian itself was a study in military pragmatism, built during an era when function mattered more than form, and designed to withstand both enemy action and bureaucratic neglect. The base layout followed standard military planning principles, with administrative buildings clustered near the main gate, operational facilities arranged for efficient workflow, and residential areas positioned to minimize interference with mission-critical activities. Every structure was built to specifications that prioritized durability over comfort, resulting in an environment that was functional but never comfortable. The motor pool occupied a strategic position within the base infrastructure, close enough to operational areas for rapid vehicle deployment, but isolated enough to contain the noise, fumes, and industrial activity that inevitably accompanied mechanical maintenance. Multiple building complexes housed different aspects of the operation: light vehicle maintenance, heavy equipment repair, parts storage and distribution, administrative offices, and specialized facilities for electronics and communications equipment. The entire compound could service everything from staff cars to armored personnel carriers, maintaining the mobility that modern military operations demanded. Social hierarchy in the motor pool followed military structure, but was complicated by the intersection of rank, technical expertise, and practical experience. Commissioned officers held ultimate authority, but rarely involved themselves in day-to-day maintenance operations, leaving actual supervision to non-commissioned officers, who understood both military protocols and mechanical realities. Senior NCOs like Sergeant Martinez carried the real responsibility for keeping vehicles operational while managing the complex dynamics of personnel at different skill levels and experience backgrounds. The enlisted mechanics existed within their own stratified system where rank, time in service, technical competence, and deployment experience all contributed to unofficial status. Fresh graduates from advanced individual training occupied the bottom tier, eager to prove themselves but lacking the seasoned judgment that came from encountering problems that weren't covered in technical manuals. Specialists and corporals with 1 or 2 years of experience formed the middle tier, competent within familiar parameters but still developing the adaptability required for unusual situations. Senior enlisted personnel, like Sergeant First Class Thompson, represented the top tier of practical expertise, combining military leadership responsibilities with technical knowledge, earned through years of maintaining equipment under various operational conditions. They served as bridges between the theoretical knowledge taught in schools and the practical realities of keeping complex mechanical systems functional in environments that constantly challenge design specifications. Civilian contractors like Sarah occupied an ambiguous position within this hierarchy. Officially, they were outside the military chain of command and worked according to contract specifications rather than military orders. Practically, they needed to integrate with military personnel and procedures while maintaining the independence that came with civilian status. The relationship could be collaborative or adversarial depending on personalities, competence levels, and organizational politics. The physical workspace reflected these hierarchical relationships through subtle but meaningful details. Senior NCOs had access to private offices with air conditioning, while junior enlisted worked in open bay areas where industrial fans provided the only relief from desert heat. Tool allocation followed similar patterns, with newer and more sophisticated diagnostic equipment reserved for higher-ranking personnel or contractors, while basic tools were available to everyone but often in conditions that reflected their position in the organizational structure. Vehicle assignments also reflected status considerations. Newer, more complex, or mission-critical vehicles were typically handled by senior mechanics or civilian specialists, while routine maintenance on older equipment was delegated to junior personnel under supervision. The 12 vehicles Sarah was inspecting represented a cross-section of the motor pool's inventory, from relatively new command variants to older utility vehicles that had accumulated significant wear from desert operations. The afternoon shift change brought additional personnel into the motor pool as day shift mechanics prepared to transfer responsibilities to evening crews. This transition period created natural opportunities for information exchange, informal consultation on technical problems, and the kind of casual conversation that built unit cohesion. It also meant that more people were present to observe interactions between Sarah and the mechanics who had been working with her throughout the day. Staff Sergeant Riley arrived early for his evening shift supervisor duties, using the overlap time to review maintenance status reports and coordinate with Martinez about ongoing projects. Riley was a 20-year veteran with multiple deployments and extensive experience managing motor pool operations under various conditions. He had developed the ability to assess workplace dynamics quickly and identify potential problems before they escalated into incidents that required formal attention. Riley noticed the subtle tension in the workbay immediately. Body language, conversation patterns, and the general atmosphere all suggested that some kind of conflict was developing between the contractor and the day shift mechanics. He'd seen similar situations before and knew they could escalate quickly if not managed properly. "How's our contractor support working out?" Riley asked Martinez privately. "Technically, no problems. She knows her stuff, finds real issues, documents everything properly. But there's some friction developing with the junior mechanics." Riley nodded. "What kind of friction?" "Hard to say exactly. They seem to think she's showing them up, questioning their competence. She's not doing anything wrong, just doing her job professionally. But you know how it is with young soldiers who think they know everything." "Want me to have a conversation with them?" Martinez considered this. Let me see how the rest of the afternoon goes. Might just be personality conflicts that'll work themselves out. But Riley had enough experience with group dynamics to recognize warning signs. Young mechanics feeling challenged by someone outside their chain of command. Civilian contractor maintaining professional boundaries instead of trying to fit in socially. And the kind of heat and pressure that made everyone's patience shorter than normal. The combination suggested potential for escalation. The work environment itself contributed to rising tension through factors that affected everyone but weren't necessarily recognized as contributing causes. Desert heat created physical stress that reduced tolerance for frustration and made minor irritations feel more significant. The constant noise level required raised voices for normal conversation, which could make routine interactions sound more confrontational than intended. Long work hours in harsh conditions accumulated, fatigue that reduced judgment and increased the likelihood of poor decisions. Institutional pressure to maintain high operational readiness created additional stress for everyone involved. Vehicles that failed inspections required additional maintenance time and resources, potentially affecting mission capabilities and reflecting poorly on the mechanics responsible for their condition. Sarah's thorough inspection methodology was identifying real problems that needed attention, but each problem represented additional work, extended timelines, and implicit criticism of previous maintenance procedures. The social dynamics were further complicated by generational and cultural factors that influenced how different people approached workplace relationships. The young mechanics had grown up in an era of social media and instant communication, expecting immediate feedback and transparent information sharing. Sarah's professional reserve and reluctance to discuss her background felt secretive and exclusionary to people who were accustomed to more open personal interaction. Military culture itself created conflicting pressures between respect for expertise and adherence to hierarchical authority. Sarah's obvious competence demanded recognition, but her civilian status and unwillingness to establish credentials within military framework created ambiguity about how she should be treated. The mechanics were caught between acknowledging her superior knowledge and maintaining their own status within the military hierarchy. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Physical workspace limitations added another layer of complexity to interpersonal dynamics. The motor pool bay was designed for vehicle maintenance rather than comfortable human interaction, with limited space that forced people to work in close proximity, whether they wanted to or not. Privacy for sensitive conversations was minimal, meaning that conflicts tended to develop in public settings, where others felt obligated to choose sides or remain uncomfortably neutral. The approaching end of the work shift created additional pressure for completion of assigned tasks. Sarah needed to finish her inspections according to her contracted timeline, while the mechanics needed to complete their own responsibilities before shift change. Time pressure reduced everyone's patience for extended explanations or diplomatic relationship building, pushing interactions toward efficiency rather than courtesy. External factors beyond anyone's direct control continued to influence the situation. Radio traffic indicated unusual activity at other base facilities, suggesting possible changes to operational schedules that could affect motor pool priorities. Supply chain issues were creating delays in parts delivery, meaning that problems Sarah identified might not be immediately repairable regardless of urgency level. Administrative requirements for documentation and reporting consumed time that everyone wished they could spend on actual maintenance work. The convergence of all these environmental, social, and organizational factors was creating conditions where a relatively minor interpersonal conflict could escalate into something more serious. None of the individual elements were particularly problematic in isolation, but their combination was building pressure that would eventually require some kind of release. The question was whether that release would be constructive resolution or destructive confrontation. Specialist Derek Williams had been having the kind of month that made young soldiers question their career choices. 3 weeks earlier, he'd failed his promotion board for the second time, watching 2 of his peers advance to sergeant while he remained stuck at his current rank. The failure stung worse because he knew the material cold, could recite technical specifications from memory, and had scored higher on written examinations than either of the soldiers who'd been promoted ahead of him. The problem, according to his evaluation feedback, was leadership presence and practical application under pressure. Williams could explain how a transmission worked in perfect technical detail, but when faced with an actual breakdown during field exercises, he'd frozen up and required assistance from a more experienced mechanic to complete the repair. The evaluation board had noted his technical knowledge, but found him lacking in the practical judgment and adaptability that separated good mechanics from great ones. Williams came from a small industrial town in Ohio where military service represented both family tradition and economic opportunity. His father had served in the Navy, his grandfather in the Army during Vietnam, and his older brother was currently deployed with the Marines in the Pacific. Military success was expected in the Williams family, not just hoped for, and Derek's struggles with advancement felt like personal failure magnified by family expectations. At 24, Williams was older than most of his peers at the same rank level, having spent 2 years in community college before enlisting. Those extra years of maturity should have been an advantage, but they'd also created expectations that his actual performance hadn't met. He'd entered military service confident that his mechanical aptitude and educational background would translate into rapid advancement, only to discover that Army maintenance operations required skills that weren't taught in civilian automotive programs. His technical knowledge was impressive but theoretical, derived from manuals and classroom instruction, rather than hands-on experience with the kind of problems that military vehicles developed under operational stress. He could diagnose textbook failures with precision, but struggled when confronted with the creative solutions required for field repairs, or the kind of intuitive troubleshooting that experienced mechanics took for granted. The contrast between his self-image and his actual performance had created a defensive mindset that looked for external explanations for his difficulties. Equipment was substandard, procedures were outdated, supervisors were biased, or fellow soldiers were getting preferential treatment. These explanations helped protect his ego but prevented him from acknowledging the areas where he genuinely needed to improve. Williams had been watching Sarah work throughout the day with growing irritation that he couldn't entirely articulate. Her competence highlighted his own limitations. Her systematic approach made his methods look haphazard, and her quiet confidence contrasted sharply with his need to verbally demonstrate his knowledge. Every problem she identified felt like an indictment of his previous inspections. Every technique she demonstrated revealed gaps in his own skills. More frustrating was her apparent indifference to his attempts to engage her in technical discussions, where he could showcase his theoretical knowledge. Williams was accustomed to impressing people with his ability to recite specifications and explain complex systems, but Sarah seemed more interested in actual condition assessments than theoretical discussions. Her focus on practical results rather than technical explanations made him feel like his strengths were being ignored. "She acts like she's the only one here who knows anything about vehicles," Williams complained to Jackson during a brief break. "Like the rest of us are just amateurs playing with tools." Jackson nodded sympathetically. "Maybe she's trying to justify her consulting fees by making everything look more complicated than it actually is." "That's exactly what I'm thinking. Find a bunch of problems that aren't really problems. Recommend unnecessary repairs. Make the Army pay for work that doesn't need to be done." Williams warmed to this theory because it provided an explanation for Sarah's competence that didn't require acknowledging his own limitations. Davis joined their conversation, carrying a clipboard with maintenance schedules that needed updating. "What are you guys talking about?" "Our contractor friend and her miracle diagnostic abilities," Williams replied. "I'm starting to think she's running some kind of scam." "What kind of scam?" Davis asked. "Think about it. She shows up, finds all these supposed problems that we missed, makes us look incompetent, then probably recommends her company for the repair contracts. Classic consulting hustle." Kim, who had been listening quietly, shook his head. "I don't think that's what she's doing. The problems she's finding are real. I've learned more about diagnostic techniques today than I did in 3 months of 8. "That's because you're impressionable," Williams snapped. "She's showing off with techniques that aren't even in the manual. Probably learned them from some YouTube videos and now thinks she's an expert. But her findings are documented with photographs and measurements," Kim protested. "This isn't guesswork or showboating. She's identifying actual mechanical issues." Williams felt his frustration building. Kim's willingness to learn from Sarah felt like betrayal, an acknowledgement that an outsider had more to teach than Williams himself. As the most senior specialist in their group, Williams felt his status being undermined by a civilian contractor who wouldn't even explain her qualifications. "The point isn't whether her findings are technically correct," Williams said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "The point is whether they represent problems that actually need immediate attention, or whether she's manufacturing work to benefit her company's bottom line." Davis considered this perspective. "I mean, some of the issues she's found probably would have shown up during regular maintenance cycles anyway. Maybe she's just jumping the timeline to create additional billable hours." "Exactly," Williams agreed. "And making us look bad in the process. Like we don't know how to maintain our own equipment." The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Martinez returning from his meeting with Riley. Martinez had spent 20 minutes discussing motor pool operations, personnel management, and the various administrative requirements that consumed increasing amounts of his time. The conversation had been routine until Riley mentioned his observations about workplace tension developing around the civilian contractor. "Any specific problems I should know about?" Martinez had asked. "Nothing concrete yet," Riley replied. "But I've seen this pattern before." Junior enlisted feeling threatened by someone with superior technical knowledge, especially when that someone is outside the military hierarchy, could escalate if not managed properly. Martinez knew Riley's assessment was usually accurate. Both NCOs had enough experience to recognize the warning signs of interpersonal conflicts that could disrupt workplace efficiency or create incidents requiring formal investigation. The challenge was addressing potential problems without creating actual problems through unnecessary intervention. Now, observing his mechanics clustered in conversation while the contractor worked alone, Martinez could see what Riley had been talking about. Body language, conversation patterns, and general atmosphere all suggested developing tension that needed attention before it became disruptive. "How's everyone doing?" Martinez asked the group generally. "Fine, Sergeant," Davis replied quickly. "Just discussing some of the inspection findings." "Any concerns about the inspection process itself?" Williams saw an opportunity to voice his suspicions in an official context. "Sergeant, I'm wondering about the scope of some of these inspections. She's finding issues that might not actually require immediate attention, and some of her diagnostic methods aren't standard procedure." Martinez had expected something like this. "What kind of issues?" "Well, like that transmission fluid analysis on Vehicle 7. The scheduled maintenance interval says we're good for another 1,000 miles. But she's recommending immediate service based on visual inspection that isn't part of standard protocol. And her recommendation is wrong?" Williams hesitated. "Not wrong exactly, but maybe unnecessarily cautious. Like she's erring on the side of finding problems rather than accepting that our regular maintenance schedule is adequate." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. So you're suggesting that her professional assessment is overly conservative compared to Army maintenance standards? I'm suggesting that she might have motivations beyond just accurate assessment, Williams replied, feeling more confident about expressing his suspicions to a supervisor who seemed receptive. What kind of motivations? Financial ones. More problems mean more repair contracts for civilian companies. Classic consultant approach. Create work to justify billing. Martinez had heard similar theories before, usually from personnel who felt their competence was being questioned by outside evaluation. Sometimes these concerns were legitimate, but more often they reflected defensive reactions to having real problems identified that previous inspections had missed. Have you reviewed her actual findings? Martinez asked. Some of them, Williams admitted. The technical details seem accurate, but the significance might be overstated. Meaning what? Meaning problems that would show up during regular maintenance. Cycles anyway are being presented as immediate concerns requiring urgent attention. Martinez was beginning to understand the dynamic. Williams felt his professional competence was being questioned and was looking for explanations that didn't require acknowledging superior knowledge on the contractor's part. This was natural human psychology, but could become problematic if it led to resistance to legitimate findings. Specialist Williams, I want you to work directly with the contractor for the rest of the afternoon. Review her methods, understand her reasoning, and provide me with a detailed assessment of her findings from your perspective as our subject matter expert. Williams felt a surge of satisfaction. Martinez was taking his concerns seriously and giving him authority to evaluate the contractor's work. This was recognition of his expertise and an opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge while exposing any problems with her methodology. Roger, Sergeant. I'll provide a comprehensive evaluation. Good. Make sure you understand her diagnostic procedures before drawing any conclusions about their validity. Martinez walked away feeling like he'd handled the situation appropriately. Give Williams responsibility for evaluating the contractor's work, which would either validate his concerns or help him understand why her methods were superior to his own approaches. Either outcome would resolve the tension while maintaining professional relationships. Williams interpreted the assignment differently. He saw it as official recognition of his expertise and authorization to challenge the contractor's findings. Martinez had essentially deputized him to investigate potential problems with her work, which validated his suspicions and gave him authority to confront her methods directly. What did Martinez want? Davis asked when Williams rejoined the group. He's concerned about some of the contractor's methods too. Asked me to work directly with her this afternoon and evaluate her findings. Kim looked puzzled. I thought her findings were pretty clearly documented and explained. Documentation can be misleading if the underlying assumptions are wrong, Williams replied. Martinez wants someone with technical expertise to verify that her conclusions are actually justified. Jackson grinned. So you're basically investigating whether she's running a scam? I'm conducting a technical evaluation of her diagnostic methodology and findings, Williams corrected, using more formal language that made his assignment sound more official and important. Davis nodded approvingly. Makes sense. Someone needs to verify that civilian contractors are actually providing value for their fees. Williams felt his confidence building. He had official authorization to challenge the contractor's work, support from his peers, and an opportunity to demonstrate his own expertise while exposing potential problems with her approach. The afternoon was looking much more promising than the morning had been. Time to find out what our consultant really knows, Williams said, walking towards Sarah's workstation with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested confrontation was inevitable. The stage was set for an escalation that would test everyone's professionalism, reveal the true extent of various people's knowledge and character, and ultimately lead to consequences that none of the participants could currently anticipate. Williams approached Sarah's work area with the confidence of someone who believed he had both authority and justification for challenging her methods, unaware that he was about to encounter expertise that would exceed his ability to evaluate or understand. Williams approached Sarah's workstation with the measured stride of someone who believed he now held official authority to question her methods. She was halfway through her inspection of Vehicle 9, a communications variant Humvee with additional electronic equipment that required specialized diagnostic procedures. Her clipboard rested on the vehicle's hood while she systematically examined the cooling system, photographing areas where hoses showed signs of stress and documenting temperatures at various measurement points. "Ma'am, I need to discuss some of your inspection findings with you," Williams announced, positioning himself where she would have to acknowledge his presence. Sarah looked up from her thermometer readings. "What specific findings?" "Several of them, actually. Sergeant Martinez asked me to review your diagnostic methodology and verify that your conclusions are technically justified." Williams emphasized Martinez's name to establish that he was operating under official authority rather than personal curiosity. "Which findings concern you?" Sarah returned to her temperature measurements. Continuing her work while listening to his questions, Williams pulled out a small notebook where he'd been recording his objections throughout the day. Starting with Vehicle 7, "You recommended immediate transmission service based on fluid analysis that isn't part of standard inspection protocol. The maintenance schedule indicates that transmission is good for another 1,000 miles. Fluid condition indicates accelerated wear beyond normal parameters for current mileage," Sarah replied without looking up from her thermometer. "Metal particulate concentration suggests internal component stress that could lead to failure before scheduled maintenance interval. But that's speculative assessment based on non-standard diagnostic techniques," Williams pressed. "Army maintenance protocols exist for good reasons. They're developed by engineers who understand these systems better than field mechanics." Sarah made notes on her clipboard and moved to the next measurement point. "Protocol assumes standard operational conditions. Desert environment, armor weight, and extended operational tempo create stresses beyond design specifications." "So you're saying Army engineers don't understand how their own vehicles perform under actual conditions?" Williams's tone was becoming more challenging, reflecting his growing confidence that he'd identified flaws in her reasoning. "I'm saying scheduled maintenance intervals may not account for actual wear rates under these specific conditions." Sarah's response remained professionally neutral, but Kim, who was observing the exchange, noticed subtle changes in her posture that suggested she was aware the conversation was shifting from technical discussion toward confrontation. Davis had joined them, drawn by the increasingly formal tone of Williams's questions. "What's the issue?" "I'm reviewing some questionable diagnostic conclusions," Williams replied, again emphasizing his official authorization. "Findings that seem designed to create additional maintenance requirements beyond established protocols." Sarah completed her cooling system inspection and began examining the vehicle's electrical connections. Every finding is documented with photographic evidence and quantitative measurements. Your maintenance supervisor can review the data and make decisions about service priorities. "That's exactly the problem," Williams said, his voice rising slightly. "You're presenting data in ways that make normal wear look like urgent problems, creating pressure for unnecessary maintenance that benefits civilian contractors. Are you suggesting my findings are inaccurate?" Sarah asked directly. Williams felt a moment of uncertainty. Her technical documentation was thorough and her measurements appeared accurate, but her conclusions seemed overly cautious compared to standard Army practices. "I'm suggesting your interpretations may be influenced by commercial considerations rather than pure technical assessment." "Commercial considerations?" "Civilian contractors benefit when they identify problems that require additional maintenance contracts. More problems mean more billable hours for your company. Sarah stopped working and looked at Williams directly. "You think I'm manufacturing problems to create business opportunities. I'm questioning whether your recommendations represent genuine urgency or consultative salesmanship," Williams replied, feeling supported by the presence of Davis and the other mechanics who had gathered to listen. Jackson stepped closer, emboldened by Williams's aggressive questioning. "It does seem convenient that you found issues with almost every vehicle you've inspected. Like maybe you're trained to find problems whether they exist or not. What would you consider an appropriate problem identification rate for vehicles operating under these conditions?" Sarah asked calmly. "Lower than 100%, Davis interjected. "If we were really missing that many problems during regular maintenance, it would reflect badly on our competence as mechanics." "Maybe." "It does," Sarah said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Davis felt his face flush with anger. Jackson's hands clenched into fists, and Williams saw an opportunity to escalate the confrontation in ways that would expose what he believed were the contractor's true motivations. "Ma'am, that's insulting to professional soldiers who maintain this equipment every day," Williams said loudly enough that other personnel in the motor pool began to notice the argument. "We follow established procedures, meet all inspection requirements, and maintain operational readiness according to Army standards. I'm not questioning your procedures," Sarah replied. "I'm documenting current vehicle condition according to my contracted scope of work." By implying that we don't know how to do our jobs properly, Davis added, his anger making his voice tight and confrontational. Sarah returned her attention to the electrical connections she was inspecting. "I'm documenting mechanical condition. Your supervisors will interpret the significance." Her refusal to engage in the argument seemed to enrage Williams further. In his experience, people who were challenged directly either defended themselves vigorously or backed down apologetically. Sarah's calm persistence with her work felt like dismissal, as if his concerns weren't worth interrupting her schedule. To address properly. "Ma'am, when a specialist in the United States Army questions your findings, the appropriate response is explanation, not indifference," Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of authority he imagined came with his rank. "An official assignment." Sarah looked up from her work again. "What explanation would satisfy you? Start with your qualifications. What makes you more qualified to assess these vehicles than trained Army mechanics with security clearances and official responsibility for their maintenance?" "My contract specifies required qualifications for this work. Your chain of command approved those qualifications when they awarded the contract." "That's not what I asked," Williams pressed. "I asked about your personal qualifications. Your background, your training, your experience with military vehicles under operational conditions. My resume is part of the contract documentation, which nobody here has seen," Jackson pointed out. "For all we know, you learned everything from YouTube videos and civilian garage experience." Kim shifted uncomfortably. The conversation was moving beyond technical disagreement into personal attack, and he could see that Sarah was being put in an impossible position. Any response she gave would either sound defensive or arrogant, while refusing to respond made her look secretive and suspicious. "Maybe that's the real problem," Davis said, warming to the theme. "Civilian contractors making money off military budgets without having served themselves, without understanding what military readiness actually means." "Did you serve?" Williams asked Sarah directly. "Do you have any actual military experience? Or are you just another contractor taking advantage of defense spending?" Sarah methodically packed her diagnostic equipment while the questions continued. Her movements remained calm and professional, but several of the mechanics noticed that she was preparing to leave rather than continuing her inspection work. "Running away from legitimate questions about your qualifications?" Williams taunted. "I'm securing my equipment before shift change," Sarah replied. "I'll resume inspections tomorrow morning." "Convenient timing," Jackson commented. Right when someone starts asking real questions about your background. Staff Sergeant Riley had been observing the developing confrontation from across the motor pool. The raised voices and confrontational body language were exactly what he'd warned Martinez about. And the situation was clearly escalating beyond professional disagreement into personal harassment. Riley approached the group with the kind of measured stride that experienced NCOs used when they needed to establish control without appearing panicked. What's the discussion about? Specialist Williams is conducting a technical review of the contractor's findings, Davis explained, trying to make their confrontation sound official and appropriate. At whose direction? Riley asked. Sergeant Martinez asked me to evaluate her diagnostic methodology, Williams replied, feeling confident that his authorization was legitimate and sufficient. Riley looked at Sarah, who was continuing to pack her equipment while listening to the conversation. Ma'am, are you having problems with the inspection process? No problems. I'll complete the remaining vehicle inspections tomorrow morning, according to schedule. Any issues with personnel support or workspace access? Sarah glanced at the mechanics, who were watching her expectantly. No issues. Riley recognized the diplomatic response of someone who didn't want to escalate a situation, but also wasn't receiving the cooperation she needed to do her job effectively. He'd seen similar dynamics before, and they usually required intervention before they became incidents that attracted unwanted attention from higher command levels. Specialist Williams, what specific technical concerns need to be addressed? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Williams felt pressure to justify his confrontational approach with concrete objections. The contractor's findings suggest systematic maintenance deficiencies that don't align with our performance records. Her recommendations would require extensive additional work that may not be justified by actual mechanical condition. Have you reviewed her documentation? I've reviewed her conclusions and questioned her methodology. That's not what I asked. Have you examined her photographic evidence, measurement data, and technical findings? Williams hesitated. He'd focused on challenging her interpretations rather than thoroughly reviewing her supporting documentation. I've reviewed the findings that seemed questionable. Which findings specifically? Under direct questioning from a senior NCO, Williams's broad accusations became harder to support. The transmission analysis on Vehicle 7 showed accelerated wear, but the significance may be overstated. Based on what technical assessment? Based on the fact that scheduled maintenance intervals are established by qualified engineers using data from extensive testing programs. Riley nodded. And the contractor's findings contradict that engineering data? They suggest that standard intervals may not be adequate under current operational conditions, which is a legitimate technical conclusion that your chain of command needs to evaluate, Riley said calmly. Anything else? Williams realized that his complaints sounded less convincing when subjected to specific questioning by someone with supervisory authority. I think her overall approach is designed to identify problems rather than assess actual condition objectively. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that she's found issues with every vehicle she's inspected. Riley looked around at the motor pool environment, noting the obvious signs of harsh operational conditions, extended use cycles, and maintenance challenges created by desert operations. In this environment, with this operational tempo, what would you consider a normal problem identification rate? Williams had no data to support his assumption that Sarah's findings were excessive, lower than what she's reporting. How much lower? I don't have specific numbers. Riley saw that Williams's objections were based on feelings rather than analysis, which meant the confrontation was personal rather than professional. That made it a leadership problem requiring intervention rather than technical disagreement requiring evaluation. Specialist Williams, tomorrow morning you'll assist the contractor with her remaining inspections. You'll review her methodology, examine her documentation, and provide me with a written assessment of her findings. Your assessment will include specific technical objections supported by quantitative analysis. Williams felt his confidence deflating. Riley was treating his concerns seriously, but requiring him to support his accusations with actual evidence rather than theoretical objections. Roger, Staff Sergeant. Everyone else, return to your assigned duties. The contractor is here to do a job that supports our mission readiness, and she'll receive full cooperation while she completes that work. The group began to disperse, but Williams felt like the confrontation was ending without resolution. He'd raised legitimate questions about the contractor's methods and motivations, but Riley was treating the situation like a personnel management issue rather than a technical evaluation problem. As Sarah finished packing her equipment, Williams made one final attempt to establish his authority in the situation. Ma'am, I'll be reviewing your work more thoroughly tomorrow. I hope you'll be prepared to explain your diagnostic procedures in detail. Sarah shouldered her tool bag and picked up her clipboard. I'll be prepared to complete my contracted inspections according to established procedures. Her response felt dismissive to Williams, as if she didn't take his evaluation seriously or respect his authority to question her methods. The feeling of being dismissed by someone who wouldn't even explain her qualifications was more frustrating than any technical disagreement could have been. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity to challenge her methods, but tonight Williams would spend time preparing questions that would expose whatever weaknesses existed in her technical knowledge and professional credentials. He was convinced that persistent, informed questioning would eventually reveal that her competence was less impressive than it appeared, and that her reluctance to discuss her background indicated something she didn't want scrutinized too closely. Next morning arrived with the kind of merciless heat that made 700 hours feel like midday in more temperate climates. Sarah returned to Fort Meridian carrying the same weathered toolbox and clipboard, wearing the same faded coveralls, displaying the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her work the previous day. She signed in at the visitor control center with identical precision, received her temporary access credentials, and walked across the compound toward Building 47 with steady, unhurried steps. Williams had arrived 30 minutes early, spending the extra time reviewing technical manuals and preparing questions designed to challenge Sarah's diagnostic methods. He'd drafted a list of specific technical points where he believed her assessments were overly conservative, identified areas where her procedures deviated from standard Army protocols, and developed what he considered a systematic approach to exposing weaknesses in her methodology. His confidence had been restored by a night of preparation and the support of his fellow mechanics, who had spent the previous evening discussing their shared suspicions about the contractor's motivations and qualifications. The group consensus was that persistent, informed questioning would eventually reveal that her apparent expertise was less substantial than it appeared, and that her reluctance to discuss her background indicated vulnerabilities she didn't want. Exposed. Davis and Jackson were already present when Sarah entered the motor pool, having coordinated their schedules to observe Williams's evaluation of her work. They'd positioned themselves where they could monitor the interaction while appearing to focus on their own assigned maintenance tasks. Kim had also arrived early, though his motivations were different from his colleagues. He was genuinely interested in learning more advanced diagnostic techniques and hoped to observe methods that weren't covered in standard training programs. "Good morning, ma'am," Williams said with exaggerated formality as Sarah approached her designated workspace. "I'll be working directly with you today to review your inspection procedures and verify your findings." Sarah nodded acknowledgement and began unpacking her diagnostic equipment. Vehicle 10 is next on the schedule. Command variant with additional communications equipment. "Before we start, I'd like to review yesterday's documentation," Williams said, producing his notebook and assuming what he believed was an authoritative posture. I have some technical questions about your methodology. Sarah handed him her inspection reports from the previous day. What specific questions? Williams opened his notebook to the first page of prepared challenges. Vehicle 7 transmission analysis. You recommended immediate fluid change based on particulate concentration, but standard maintenance schedule indicates adequate service life remaining. Can you explain the technical justification for overriding established maintenance intervals? Fluid analysis showed metal particle concentration indicating accelerated wear beyond normal parameters. Sarah replied, setting up her diagnostic equipment while answering his questions. Desert conditions and operational tempo create stresses that exceed design specifications. But you're making that assessment based on visual inspection rather than laboratory analysis, Williams pressed. How can you determine particle concentration accurately without spectroscopic analysis? Sarah looked at him directly. Experience with how different metals appear in suspension under various wear conditions. Visual assessment combined with field testing provides sufficient accuracy for maintenance recommendations. Williams felt encouraged that she'd acknowledged the limitations of field testing methods. So your recommendations are based on subjective interpretation rather than quantitative analysis? Subjective interpretation informed by extensive experience with similar vehicles under comparable conditions. Sarah corrected, returning her attention to equipment setup. What experience specifically? Williams asked, sensing an opportunity to press for details about her background. What vehicles, what conditions, what operational context? Sarah began connecting diagnostic cables to Vehicle 10's electrical system, various military vehicles under field conditions. That's not specific enough for technical verification, Williams said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he felt he was gaining advantage in an argument. What branch of service, what units, what theater of operations? Civilian contractor experience. Sarah replied without elaboration. Davis had been listening to this exchange while pretending to work on a nearby vehicle. Ma'am, civilian contractors usually have specific client references and project histories they can cite to establish credibility. Jackson joined the conversation, emboldened by Williams's persistent questioning, especially when they're making recommendations that contradict established military procedures. Sarah continued her diagnostic setup without responding to their comments. Her refusal to engage in extended justification of her qualifications was becoming more noticeable and, from the mechanic's perspective, more suspicious. Ma'am, we're trying to understand your background so we can properly evaluate your findings, Williams said, adopting what he believed was a reasonable tone. Professional mechanics typically discuss their training and experience when working with new colleagues. My qualifications are documented in the contract specifications, Sarah replied, beginning her systematic inspection of Vehicle 10's engine compartment, which none of us have access to, Davis pointed out. We're supposed to cooperate with your inspection, but we don't know anything about your actual expertise. Kim watched this interrogation with growing discomfort. The questioning was becoming more aggressive and personal, moving beyond legitimate technical concerns toward harassment. He could see that Sarah was maintaining professional composure, but the situation was clearly becoming more confrontational than necessary. Staff Sergeant Riley entered the motor pool as the mechanic's questioning was intensifying. He'd received a briefing from Martinez about yesterday's tensions and had been specifically instructed to monitor the interaction between Williams and the civilian contractor. The tone of conversation he was hearing suggested that the situation was escalating rather than resolving itself through professional cooperation. How's the inspection proceeding? Riley asked the group generally. We're trying to establish technical context for the contractor's findings, Williams replied, emphasizing his official assignment. Some of her recommendations seem inconsistent with standard procedures, so we need to understand her qualifications and experience. Riley observed Sarah's continued focus on her inspection work despite the ongoing interrogation. "Ma'am, are you receiving adequate cooperation for completing your assigned tasks?" "No problems with the inspection process," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm proceeding according to schedule." Riley recognized the same careful neutrality she displayed the previous day. Someone who was being harassed but didn't want to escalate the situation by filing formal complaints. The pattern suggested that intervention might be necessary if the mechanics continued their confrontational approach. Specialist Williams focused on technical evaluation rather than background investigation. The contractor's qualifications were verified before contract award. Williams felt frustrated by Riley's intervention. "Staff Sergeant, I'm conducting the technical review you assigned. Understanding her experience is necessary for evaluating her methodology. Understanding her findings is what's necessary. Focus on the technical data rather than personal information." But Williams had invested too much preparation time and emotional energy in his confrontational approach to abandon it easily. "Staff Sergeant, we have legitimate concerns about recommendations that could require extensive maintenance beyond established schedules. What specific technical objections do you have to her documented findings?" Williams realized that his broad suspicions were difficult to translate into specific technical criticisms. "I question whether her interpretations represent actual urgency or consulting salesmanship designed to create additional billable work." Riley's expression hardened. "Are you accusing the contractor of fraudulent reporting?" "I'm questioning her motivations and suggesting that her conclusions may be influenced by commercial considerations rather than pure technical assessment." Sarah stopped working and looked at Williams directly. "You're accusing me of falsifying inspection results for financial gain?" "I'm suggesting that your recommendations may be unnecessarily conservative to create opportunities for additional maintenance contracts," Williams replied, standing by his accusations despite the increasingly formal tone of the conversation. Davis stepped forward to support his colleague. "Ma'am, it does seem convenient that you found problems with every vehicle you've inspected. Like maybe you're trained to identify issues regardless of actual condition." Jackson nodded agreement. "Civilian contractors benefit when they create work for other civilian contractors. More problems mean more repair contracts." Sarah methodically began disconnecting her diagnostic equipment from vehicle 10. Her movements were calm and deliberate, but several people noticed that she was preparing to leave rather than continuing her inspection work. Riley saw that the situation was deteriorating beyond professional disagreement into professional disagreement into professional deteriorating beyond professional disagreeing deteriorant into two severe personal accusations that could create incidents requiring formal investigation. Everyone needs to step back and focus on mission requirements rather than personal theories about contractor motivations. "Staff Sergeant, we're just asking legitimate questions about her qualifications and methods," Williams protested. "Professional verification, that's standard in any technical field. What you're doing is harassment based on speculation rather than evidence," Riley replied firmly. "The contractor is here under official contract to perform specific technical services, and she received professional courtesy while completing that work." Williams felt his authority being undermined by Riley's intervention. After spending the night preparing for this confrontation, being told to abandon his investigation felt like professional defeat. "Staff Sergeant, I have concerns about the technical validity of her findings." "Then document those concerns with specific technical objections supported by quantitative analysis, not personal attacks on her background and motivations." But Williams was too invested in his confrontational approach to retreat gracefully. "Staff Sergeant, I think we need to verify that this contractor actually has the qualifications claimed in her documentation. How do you propose to do that?" Williams had been building toward this moment since the previous afternoon. Standard security verification. Check for contraband devices. Verify that she's not carrying unauthorized electronics that could compromise sensitive information. Riley's expression became very serious. Are you suggesting a security search of contractor personnel? I'm suggesting verification that she's not carrying devices that could be used for unauthorized data collection or transmission. Williams replied, trying to make his proposal sound like legitimate security procedure rather than personal harassment. Davis supported the suggestion. New security protocols require verification for uncleared personnel in restricted areas. Standard procedure. That was completely false, and Riley knew it. But before he could correct the misstatement, Jackson had pulled out his phone and was holding it ready to record. Just following regulations, Staff Sergeant. Kim realized that the situation was about to escalate in ways that would create serious problems for everyone involved. Guys, maybe we should just focus on the technical inspection rather than security issues. Security is everyone's responsibility, Williams replied, feeling momentum building for his proposed course of action. We can't assume that civilian contractors with unknown backgrounds are automatically trustworthy in sensitive areas. Sarah had finished packing her diagnostic equipment and was preparing to leave. I'll return when the workspace is available for completing assigned inspections. Ma'am, if you're not carrying anything inappropriate, then verification shouldn't be a problem, Williams said, positioning himself between Sarah and the exit. Standard security check to protect classified information and sensitive equipment. Rayleigh stepped forward to intervene, but Williams had already committed to his course of action. Ma'am, I need to verify that you're not carrying unauthorized electronic devices. New security protocols require physical inspection of personnel and equipment. That's not accurate, Riley said firmly. There are no such protocols, and you don't have authority to conduct security searches of contractor personnel. But Williams was beyond listening to supervisory guidance. He was convinced that persistent pressure would eventually expose whatever Sarah was hiding, and he interpreted Riley's intervention as confirmation that higher authority was protecting the contractor from legitimate scrutiny. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remove your outer clothing so we can verify that you're not concealing unauthorized devices, Williams said with what he believed was official authority. The motor pool became very quiet. Tools stopped running, conversations ceased, and everyone present realized that the situation had crossed a line from professional disagreement into something potentially serious enough to require formal investigation. Sarah stood quietly for a moment, looking at Williams with an expression that several people later described as completely calm, but somehow more intimidating than anger would have been. You want me to remove my clothing? Upper body search for unauthorized electronics. Standard security procedure for uncleared personnel in restricted areas. Riley was reaching for his radio to call for supervisory assistance when Major Catherine Cross walked through the motor pool entrance for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of maintenance operations. She was accompanied by Captain Torres from the base security office and Sergeant Major Harrison from the motor pool's parent unit, conducting their monthly review of operational procedures and personnel performance. Cross was a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments and extensive experience managing complex military operations under challenging conditions. She had developed the ability to assess situations quickly and identify problems that required immediate attention. The scene she encountered in the motor pool bay was obviously problematic, though she didn't yet understand the specific details. What's the situation here? Cross asked Riley directly. Ma'am, we have a civilian contractor conducting vehicle inspections, and some of our personnel have raised questions about security protocols. Cross looked around the bay, noting the confrontational body language, the contractor standing isolated, with her equipment packed, and the obvious tension that suggested something significant was developing. What kind of security questions? Williams saw an opportunity to present his concerns to higher authority. "Ma'am, we have an uncleared civilian contractor who refuses to provide background information and may be carrying unauthorized electronic devices in a restricted area. And your proposed solution? Physical search to verify that she's not concealing devices that could be used for unauthorized information collection." Cross looked at Sarah, who was standing quietly beside her packed equipment, and at Williams, who was clearly agitated and convinced of his own authority. The dynamic was familiar from other situations, where junior personnel had exceeded their authority while believing they were protecting security interests. "Specialist Williams, you don't have authority to conduct searches of contractor personnel. Such searches require specific authorization and proper procedures." "Ma'am, I'm just following security protocols to protect classified information and sensitive equipment." "What protocols specifically?" Williams realized he couldn't cite actual protocols because the procedures he was claiming didn't exist. "General security awareness, ma'am. Verification that uncleared personnel aren't carrying devices that could compromise sensitive information." Cross turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, are you willing to submit to voluntary search to resolve these security concerns?" Everyone expected Sarah to refuse, to demand formal procedures, to require proper authorization before submitting to what was clearly harassment disguised as security verification. Instead, she set down her toolbox and reached for the zipper of her coveralls. "If it will allow me to complete my assigned work," she said quietly, pulling the zipper down and pushing the coveralls off her shoulders. The coveralls dropped to Sarah's waist with the soft whisper of worn fabric, revealing a plain gray t-shirt underneath that had been washed so many times the original color was more memory than reality. She methodically tied the sleeves around her hips, transforming the coveralls into a makeshift belt, her movements economical and precise. There was no hesitation, no shame, no attempt to maintain modesty beyond the practical minimum required. By the situation, Williams felt a surge of vindication mixed with uncomfortable arousal that he tried to suppress. His confrontational strategy was working, forcing the contractor to submit to his authority and exposing her to the kind of scrutiny he believed she'd been avoiding. The fact that she'd agreed to the search without legal protest seemed to confirm his suspicions that she had something to hide, though he couldn't yet identify what that might be. Davis stepped closer, ostensibly to observe the search but actually to satisfy curiosity about what the middle-aged contractor looked like without her shapeless work clothes. Jackson held his phone at waist level, angling it to capture video while pretending to check messages. The recording wasn't official documentation. It was entertainment for later sharing with friends who hadn't witnessed the incident personally. Kim stood further back, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. What had started as technical disagreement about inspection methods had evolved into personal harassment that seemed designed more to humiliate than to address legitimate security concerns. He could see that Sarah was maintaining dignity despite the circumstances, but the whole scene felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Riley was reaching for his radio to request supervisory intervention when Major Cross raised her hand to stop him. She wanted to see how the situation developed before deciding whether formal intervention was necessary. In her experience, allowing incidents to play out sometimes revealed information that immediate intervention would have concealed. The contractor's willingness to submit to unauthorized search procedures suggested either unusual cooperation or confidence that the search wouldn't reveal anything problematic. Captain Torres from base security watched with professional interest, noting that the search procedures being employed were completely improper and that the civilian contractor was being subjected to harassment that could create legal liability for the military personnel involved. He was preparing to terminate the incident when Cross gestured for him to wait, apparently wanting to observe the complete interaction before making official determination about appropriate responses. Sarah's gray t-shirt was thin from repeated washing and clung to her torso in ways that revealed she was in better physical condition than her age and demeanor suggested. Her shoulders showed muscle definition that came from functional strength rather than gymnasium exercises, and her posture remained erect despite the obviously humiliating circumstances. She stood with her arms at her sides, neither covering herself nor displaying herself, simply enduring whatever scrutiny was required to return to her assigned work. Satisfied? She asked Williams directly. Williams realized that the search hadn't revealed any concealed electronic devices, which meant his security justification was proving baseless. But backing down now would acknowledge that his confrontational approach had been inappropriate from the beginning, and admitting error in front of higher authority could have career consequences he wasn't prepared to accept. "Turn around," he ordered. Full inspection. Several people in the motor pool became visibly uncomfortable with the direction of Williams's demands. Staff Sergeant Riley took a step forward, clearly intending to terminate the incident, but Major Cross again gestured for him to wait. Something about the situation was capturing her attention in ways that suggested she was seeing details others were missing. Sarah turned slowly, presenting her back to the assembled group. The thin t-shirt revealed the outline of what appeared to be extensive tattooing between her shoulder blades, dark lines that showed through the faded fabric like shadows cast by internal structure. The markings weren't immediately identifiable, but their size and complexity suggested they were more than decorative ink chosen for aesthetic reasons. Jackson zoomed his phone camera in on her back, trying to capture clearer images of whatever was visible through her shirt. "Check it out," he whispered to Davis. "Granny's got some serious ink under there." Davis squinted at the shadowy outlines. "Probably got it when she was young and stupid. Most people regret tattoos that big." Williams saw the tattoo markings as another opportunity to establish his authority and demonstrate thorough search procedures. "Ma'am, I need you to remove your shirt so we can verify that you're not concealing electronic devices against your skin." The request crossed another boundary from security procedure into personal violation, and several people in the motor pool recognized that the situation was becoming legally problematic. Rayleigh stepped forward again, this time with clear intention to intervene regardless of Major Cross's previous signals. "Specialist Williams, that's enough," Riley said firmly. "You've verified that the contractor isn't carrying unauthorized devices. The search is complete." But Williams was too committed to his confrontational approach to accept supervision that would undermine his authority in front of the contractor and his peers. "Staff Sergeant, thorough security verification requires complete inspection. Electronic devices can be concealed against skin using medical tape or specialized equipment. That was complete fabrication, and everyone present knew it. Electronic devices couldn't be effectively concealed against bare skin without being obvious to visual inspection, and medical tape wouldn't provide adequate concealment for any device sophisticated enough to pose actual security risks." Williams was manufacturing justification for continuing harassment that had already exceeded any reasonable security requirements. Major Cross found herself in an unusual position. Military protocol demanded that she terminate unauthorized search procedures being conducted by personnel without proper authority. But her experience with classified operations had taught her that sometimes irregular situations revealed information that formal procedures would miss. The contractor's continued cooperation, despite obviously improper treatment, suggested either unusual submission or confidence that compliance wouldn't create problems. More intriguingly, something about the contractor's bearing and responses was triggering recognition that Cross couldn't quite place. The woman's posture, her calm acceptance of humiliating treatment, her professional competence, and her reluctance to discuss background details were creating a pattern that felt familiar from other contexts. Sarah reached for the bottom edge of her t-shirt without arguing with Williams's demands or appealing to higher authority for protection from harassment. she could have refused. Her compliance wasn't submission. It was the practical acceptance of someone who had endured worse treatment under more dangerous circumstances and understood that resistance would create more problems than cooperation. She pulled the t-shirt over her head in a single smooth motion, revealing a sports bra and the kind of lean, functional physique that came from years of physical demands rather than recreational fitness. But those details became irrelevant the moment her back was fully visible, because the tattoo between her shoulder blades was unlike anything most people had ever seen. The ink was black, precise, and immediately recognizable to anyone with knowledge of military special operations designations. At the top, centered between her shoulder blades, was a skull viewed from the front, with crosshairs overlaid across the eye sockets. Below the skull, in block letters that looked like military stenciling, were the words 75th Ranger Regiment, with a tab above reading Ranger, in the distinctive yellow and black coloration used by that elite unit. But those elements were just the beginning of what was carved into her skin with military precision. Below the Ranger designation was a specialized badge that made several people in the motor pool catch their breath. It was a sniper qualification badge, but not the standard version issued to conventional military personnel. This was the specialized qualification awarded to Rangers who had completed the most advanced marksmanship training available to U.S. military personnel. The badge showed crosshairs with a target silhouette in the center, surrounded by scrollwork. That included distance markers, wind indicators, and environmental factors that only trained snipers would recognize as significant. Around the central design were smaller symbols that documented specific qualifications: urban operations, long-range precision, counter-sniper techniques, and specialized equipment certifications that required months of intensive training to achieve. Below the sniper badge, arranged in neat rows like service ribbons on a dress uniform, were hash marks that represented confirmed kills. Each mark was precisely rendered, with different symbols indicating different types of engagements: single targets, multiple targets, moving targets, extreme distance shots, and environmental conditions that made particular eliminations technically remarkable. The bottom of the tattoo contained information that was even more significant to people who understood military classification systems: unit designation numbers, operational codes, and date ranges that indicated deployment history in areas where American forces had operated under deep classification. The numbers and letters were arranged in the kind of precise formatting used for official documentation, suggesting that the tattoo served as permanent record of service that couldn't be lost, stolen, or officially erased. Jackson's phone captured every detail as he recorded the full tattoo without understanding what he was documenting. "Holy shit," he whispered. "Look at all that military stuff." Davis stared at the markings with growing comprehension. His grandfather had served in Vietnam and had shown him photographs of unit tattoos from that era, explaining how specialized military personnel sometimes documented their service in ways that couldn't be officially acknowledged. This tattoo was similar but far more complex and detailed than anything from his grandfather's generation. Kim felt his stomach drop as he began to understand what they were looking at. The precision of the artwork, the military terminology, the specialized badges and qualifications. This wasn't decorative ink chosen for personal expression. This was a service record carved into skin by someone whose military background was far more extensive and specialized than anyone had imagined. William stared at the tattoo with confusion and growing unease. He recognized some of the military symbols from training materials, but the overall combination was beyond his knowledge base. The skull and crosshairs looked like special operations markings. The Ranger designation indicated elite infantry training, and the sniper badge suggested specialized skills that were rare even within military communities. Staff Sergeant Riley felt his professional composure cracking as he processed what he was seeing. 20 years of military service had given him enough knowledge to recognize that the tattoo documented service with units that most people never heard about, in operations that weren't discussed in official channels. The woman they'd been harassing as an unqualified civilian contractor was carrying permanent evidence of military credentials that exceeded anything possessed by anyone else in the motor pool, but it was Major Catherine Cross who fully understood what she was looking at, and her reaction was immediate and dramatic. The clipboard she'd been carrying hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the motor pool bay, causing everyone to turn toward her in surprise. Cross had spent 3 years working intelligence liaison during peak combat operations in Afghanistan, reading classified reports and debriefing personnel from special operations units, whose missions were so sensitive that even their existence was compartmentalized. She'd seen similar tattoos in classified photographs, heard stories about Rangers who'd operated so far outside normal military structure that their service records were maintained separately from standard personnel systems. The specific combination of elements in Sarah's tattoo told a story that Cross recognized from intelligence briefings she'd received about operations that officially never happened. The 75th Ranger Regiment designation, combined with specialized sniper qualifications and the particular arrangement of operational codes, indicated someone who had served with the most elite elements of American Special Operations Forces. More significantly, the hash marks and unit designations suggested service in areas and time periods that Cross knew had been covered by classification levels that made normal military secrecy look transparent by comparison. The woman standing half-dressed in their motor pool wasn't just a veteran. She was someone whose military service had been so sensitive that her records were probably sealed at levels that required presidential authorization to access. "Jesus Christ," Cross whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying enough shock that everyone in the immediate area heard her. The Major's reaction created a moment of absolute silence in the motor pool. Tools stopped running, conversations ceased entirely, and everyone present realized that something significant had just been revealed, even if they didn't understand what that something was. Cross's obvious recognition of the tattoo's significance suggested that the civilian contractor they'd been harassing was someone whose background was far more complex than anyone had suspected. Williams looked between Cross's shocked expression and Sarah's tattoo, trying to understand what connection existed between them. The Major's reaction suggested that the ink carried meaning beyond personal decoration, but Williams lacked the knowledge base to interpret either the specific symbols or their apparent significance to higher authority. Sarah stood quietly, allowing the inspection to continue while Major Cross processed what she was seeing. There was no embarrassment, no attempt to hide the tattoo, no explanation offered for markings that were clearly generating reactions she'd expected. Her calm acceptance of the situation suggested that being recognized by her ink wasn't unprecedented in her experience. The silence stretched longer as Cross continued staring at the tattoo, her professional composure completely shattered by recognition that was transforming her understanding of everything that had led to this moment. The harassment, the unauthorized search, the assumptions about the contractor's qualifications, all of it was being recontextualized by evidence that painted a completely different picture of who they were dealing with. "Ma'am," Cross finally managed to say, her voice tight with what might have been awe or fear, "you can get dressed." Sarah pulled her t-shirt back on with the same unhurried precision she'd used to remove it, then began putting her coveralls back on while Major Cross processed what she'd witnessed. The motor pool remained silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the sound of fabric rustling as Sarah dressed. Task Force Viper was disbanded in 2013, Cross said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge. "Officially, it never existed." "Officially, a lot of things never existed," Sarah replied, zipping up her coveralls and picking up her toolbox. "But vehicles still need maintenance." Cross turned to Williams, who was standing frozen with the growing realization that he'd just forced a decorated special operations veteran to strip for his entertainment. "Corporal Williams, report to my office immediately. Bring your supervisor." Williams's face went pale. "Ma'am, I was just following security protocols. You were harassing a veteran whose service record is classified at levels you don't have clearance to understand. Move." Jackson quickly deleted the video from his phone, but Cross had already seen him recording. "Private Jackson, you'll be joining that meeting. Anyone else who participated in this harassment will explain their actions to my investigation board." As the mechanic scattered, Cross approached Sarah. "Ma'am, I apologize for what happened here. This reflects poorly on our entire command." Sarah shouldered her tool bag. "I'll be back tomorrow to finish the inspection. Those vehicles still need to be mission ready." Walking toward the exit, she paused and looked back at the motor pool where young soldiers were learning that quiet competence often masks extraordinary sacrifice. "The loudest person in the room," she said softly, "is rarely the most dangerous." 3 months later, Williams was washing dishes at a different base. Jackson had been demoted, and new protocols ensured contractors received proper respect regardless of their apparent background. Because sometimes the person you underestimate has stories written in scars and ink that your security clearance isn't high enough to read. Ever witness someone get humbled when they picked the wrong person to mess with? Drop your stories in the comments below. If this tale of hidden heroes hit different, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. Your next mind-blowing story starts in 302. 1.